What happens when a thunder god crashes into the grim darkness of the far future? In this episode, we imagine Thor arriving in Warhammer 40,000. We'll explore how he breaches real space, how his power stacks up against Astartes, Titans and Psykers, how the Imperium, Xenos and Chaos react, and we'll stage a storm-racked showdown that could tilt the fate of a sector. Strap in. This is pure fan-made myth-making and ruthless 40K logic colliding. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence, not the blessed silence of a chapel or the cold hush before a firing line. This was the sudden deadness of 1,000,000 overlapping signals cut from the throat at once. Orbit-to-surface relays blinked red. Voxcasters spat static. The Hive's air defense cogitators threw up a pale lattice of no data where there should have been threat cones and burn-in trails. For 3 heartbeats, Hellwinter 9, 40 billion souls, stacked in iron hives and promethium fog, forgot how to breathe. Then the sky split. From the black between the stars, a straight line of impossible color punched through the firmament like a spear made of weather. It wasn't a beam in the way a lance battery was a beam. It was a bridge, a segment of storm laid sideways through reality. Atmosphere ionized around it with the sharp, metallic tang of pre-rain. Thunder rolled without echo, as if the world didn't know where to put the sound. On the command deck of the Imperial frigate, Gloria Mortis, the navigator tore the veil from her third eye and reeled back with a hiss. "There is a road in the sea," she whispered, voice ribboned with the aftertaste of ozone. "A road the warp does not own." Geller wards, etched into that ship's bones like prayers in old scars, thrummed an unfamiliar chord, neither warning nor comfort. Something like recognition, but not quite. Below, in Hive Karax, a junior Vox officer named Savin jolted at the slap of a rusted hand on his shoulder. The hand belonged to Scarlet Vector 12, a tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose robes smelled faintly of machine oil and incense. "Repeat your Auspex litany," the Magos intoned. "And slowly." I can't get range," Savin stammered, fingers dancing across brass toggles. "It reads as atmospheric phenomenon. Classification, unknown. Energy density is..." He swallowed, watched the rune climb up a scale he'd never seen move. Climbing. "Observe the waveform," Scarlet said, mechadendrites already plugging into the console. In the noosphere, graphs bloomed like fever dreams, harmonic ladders stacked in perfect ratios, a storm you could set a metronome to. "This is not chaos," Scarlet announced, and the room loosened its shoulders by half a hair's breadth. "This is a lawful anomaly." "Saints preserve us," someone muttered. Across the Hive, in the astropathic sanctum buried behind meters of lead and prayer, a choir of psychers sat strapped into their thrones. Their mouths were foxed with old scars. Their eyes were cataracted with stars. At the first rip of light, they keened, high and thin, like metal cooling too fast. The acting choir mistress, Sister Halix, slid a needle of gold into a vein and steadied her breath. She reached into the Empyrean and tasted rain. Not blood rain, not ichor, not the copper of rage or the sugar sour of deceit. Clean water. Stone struck by storm. A word pressed at the edge of speakable sound, a name that was not a name in any Imperial lexicon, carrying meaning closer to thunder than to language. She tried to pin it to High Gothic, and the letters would not hold. They scattered like birds. In the Underhive, a child counted the time between flashes and booms the way her grandmother taught her, and no matter how she counted, she always got one. The Bridge of Storm touched down. It chose a place as though it had been measured long ago, the blasted plain beyond Karax's eastern wall, where traitor artillery had been lifting dirt and lives for 9 long months. A column of light struck the ground and pushed reality outward, flattening air into rings that ran for kilometers. A basilisk regiment, busy reloading, looked up to see their shells sweat frost in the sudden pressure drop. The gun captain opened his mouth to tell his men to look away, and a brightness walked into his pupils and wrote itself there. Machinery hiccuped everywhere. Void shields warbled with the sound of chimes in a hurricane. Servo skulls carved lazy figure eights as their gyros fought something that wasn't gravity, yet behaved like it. Even the plague banners across the heretic trench lines sagged, their horrid pictograms running like wet paint as if the storm disapproved of their artistry. Lightning came down like braided cable, knotting itself around a shape that wasn't there until it was. The air bulged. Ozone slapped the tongue. A silhouette resolved. A man-sized geometry at the center of a crater that wasn't a crater, but a bowl scooped from the world by instruction. Heat bled away. Then the heat returned. Then neither was true. The storm exhaled. He stood. Everything in 40,000 years of human war taught the human eye how to recognize a weapon. The hammer in his fist had that recognition. It was too simple to be a relic, too beautiful to be merely functional, too heavy for a mortal arm. And yet it moved as if it were remembering a dance. Runes crawled along its head, like lightning learning how to write. The haft seemed to be both leather and storm-struck root. When it kissed the dust learned what a bell sounded like. He wore no void-sealed plate, no authority sigil, no cogwheel or aquila or rune of any empire known to man or Xeno. Only the armor of a myth told to fires in ages before the Imperium. It fitted him like an oath. Hair bright as beaten gold tangled in the wind that loved him. The storm loved him. That much was obvious. The world, for now, tolerated him. On Gloria Mortis, the captain snapped for firing solutions, then stopped. The cogitators offered no model. Macro lances required vectors, and this intruder was an event, not a ship. The captain's lips jerked. Classification request. Inquisitorial clearance required, chimed a pitiless machine voice. Suggested temporary tag, Omega Prime Metaphasic Visitation. The Mechanicus would add a dozen more tags within the minute. The Inquisition would add questions. The Ecclesiarchy would add hymns. But on the ground, it was simpler. A line of traitor guard, half melted by radiation and zealotry, steadied lasguns with hands that wanted to shake. Their commissar, mask lacquered red with somebody else's virtue, lifted a power sword. "Fire!" he howled. They did. Red needles stitched a net around the newcomer. The net burned and didn't burn him. Lightning moved like a living thing, chose beam after beam, and ate them. Where the lasfire passed through and struck the hive wall beyond, it blistered old paint and woke nesting vermin. Where it struck him, it added a fraction of a fraction to something he already had in terrible plenty. Mjolnir, if that was the name, rose. Skies listened for a command they already knew. Light gathered in his palm as fluidly as water finds the ocean. He did not so much hurl the hammer as allow it to leave him. It went out on a straight line of intent, and everything that line crossed was obliged to behave. Traitor gun emplacements flowered open. A stolen chimera rolled over on its side like a sleeping animal. A ceramite bunker shrugged, forgot being a bunker, and became a pile of obedient slabs. The hammer returned, gentle as a sparrow, heavy as a verdict. "Saint," someone whispered on the wall above, and someone else hissed, "Silence!" Because saints came with inquisitors, and inquisitors came with burning. Theories tried to breed in the minds of those qualified to have them. Scarlet Vector 12, still linked to a dozen machine spirits, felt the litany threads try to weave themselves around the event and slide off. Not Xenos. Eldar sorcery wore the fingerprint of probability. Not Necron. Necrodermis sang its own sterile song. Not the old night either. That sadness had a taste of abandonment. This was a thing that acted like a law rather than a desire. Lightning that wanted to be justice. In the sanctum, Sister Helix had tears on her face, astonished and furious at herself. The choir's minds held like disciplined spears, and yet there was a resonance they could not deny. Something brushed their edges that the warp did not hate. That alone made it dangerous beyond scale. The Empyrean despises boundary conditions. This arrival carried one in its skin. She forced the thought into shape. If the warp could not name him, it would try to unmake him. Or it would learn his name. Inside the traitor lines, a champion of contagious gods laughed, raising a chain axe tattooed with sigils that were more wound than ink. He roared a challenge, threaded with a caller's right, to pull a favor from beyond. Lightning answered first. It found metal and meat in equal measure. The laugh stopped halfway and came apart into steam. He looked up. The storm looked down. For a brief, careening instant, the entire Hive world remembered what weather had been before Hive towers gouged the sky. It had been a conversation between earth and heaven, and sometimes, just sometimes, the heaven had a face. He took a step. Thunder accompanied it like bodyguards. The earth presented itself politely, each footfall given what it needed to be dignified. The line of traitors broke at the third step, instinct older than ideology asserting itself. A handful dragged their commissar backward as he tried to remember a speech. The Hive Wall's gunnery crews found their target as suddenly precise and measured at ranges that shouldn't have been precise or measured. The storm corrected. Vox channels woke one by one. Fragments flooded back as if the city had been submerged and found air again. Pete, ground control, hostile in the open. Not hostile. Hold fire. Hold. Classification pending. Emperor, guide us. That's a man. Not a man. Sarvin turned to Skurrit. Orders? Observe, said the Magos, because he was an honest servant of the machine and knew when he did not have a model. Record. Pray. The figure angled his chin, reading a sky full of artillery ghosts and carrier pigeons that had become satellites. He drew in a breath the Hive had pre-poisoned centuries ago, and the air decided, temporarily, to be better for him than for anyone else. Rain chose to fall around him in a perfect circle, the drops beading off an invisible dome, refusing his skin the way an altar refuses a stain. An old worker in a rusted rebreather reached up and touched her cheek as if to check whether she had any tears left. He looks like the stories, she said to no one, to everyone. Then he is an enemy of stories, a preacher rasped, clutching his book with white knuckles. Only the Emperor, writes our myths. On the ridge beyond the plain, a trio of hulking shapes pivoted, loyalist knights, their pilots split between fear and professional attention. Their princeps murmured machine prayers and watched capacitors climb. If this visitor was a weapon, he was an unmodeled ally. If he was a god, there would be politics. If he was a demon cleverly clothed, there would be fire. A lightning fork grounded into a heretic macro battery and turned its ammunition into a sunset in the wrong direction. The blast rolled over the plain like a thrown carpet. He didn't look back to admire it. The hammer lifted again. The storm leaned in like a daw waiting for a command. For a handful of seconds, stretched until they felt sacred, the galaxy's ugliest war paused to watch something elegant. Under Karax's spires, in a chapel where the candles were out and the walls sweated with the breath of too many people, a woman whose faith had been worn down to a thread felt it snag and hold. On a distant deck, a navigator sealed her eye and discovered a hole in fear big enough to breathe through. In the sanctum, Sister Helix swallowed the name that wasn't a name and found her mouth full of thunder. In a cog-strangled brain, a tech priest filed a new category. Machine spirits could be awed. Rain began in earnest. Fat, heavy drops pocked the dust and sank into it as if the world were thirsty. Far away, the desert bands would green for a week and then go back to dying. Close at hand, men stopped killing long enough to decide how to start again. He stood amid that decision, the storm choosing him as its address. Either the galaxy would explain him, or it would change around him. Either way, the bridge that brought him flickered once, like a heartbeat too strong for the artery, and went out. Power is a language the 41st millennium understands, and it insists on grammar. The Mechanicus begins, as always, by trying to conjugate the intruder. They bring out measuring rights reserved for titans and for machines that dream. They count photons. They time thunder. They feed storm hums into logic engines that prefer numbers to miracles. What comes back is a profile without precedent, a stack of harmonics behaving like doctrine, repeatable, obedient to internal rules, resistant to warp noise the way a hymn is resistant to gossip. It is not cleanly technological, not filthily empiric. It sits sideways to both. Power, here, is the ability to force reality to choose you. He can do that. The most basic benchmark is a transhuman with a gun. Astartes in Mark 7 plate step into the rain and let their autosenses drink him in. Thermal profile, magnetic footprint, kinematics. Their bolters rise in salute and suspicion. Bolt shells are little gods, cased propellant, gyrojet guidance, mass reactive cores that erupt inside you and call it sacrament. He hears them coming the way a field hears a hailstorm. When the first volley stitches toward him, lightning lifts off the ground and meets the shells mid-flight like a flock of carnivorous birds. Some detonate early with dirty little suns. Some lose guidance as their avionics swallow raw static. The few that reach him chew against an invisible pressure that isn't a void shield. Void shields reject. This embraces and slows, converts kinetic tantrum into ecstatic glow, then returns the favor down the path of approach. Ceramite blackens. The Astartes helms record atmospheric nitrogen reorganizing into patterns the litanies don't have words for. They test blades. A chainsword teethes at him, and he lets it bite. Sparks scream out and veer back toward the blade like iron filings to a magnet, as if the storm is telling the weapon to keep its anger to itself. A power sword, field humming, meets the hammer head, and the field stutters, chokes, steadies. Worthiness is not a number a field can understand, but it can be a condition, and conditions are everything in physics. When a veteran sergeant in Artificer Plate steps in with the speed that kills men before their fear arrives, he discovers the simple ugliness of truth. This stranger is faster, not because his muscles are braided with Gene Lab myth, but because a storm does not move from one place to another. It becomes in two places and lets the rest of the world interpolate. Heavy guns speak next, because heavy guns believe they end conversations. A Lehman Russ battle cannon thunders. The shell bores a white path of compressed air toward him. He does not step aside. He turns the hammer and presents the flat as if catching a thrown plate. The impact should share itself out as heat, fragmentation, shrapnel scripture written into flesh. Instead, there's a single, bell-like report. The shell pauses in a physics that belongs to him, its fuse counting, confused, then reverses with a courtesy that makes gunners swear oaths they didn't know. It detonates among the heretics who launched it, the storm stamping the blast inward, denying it the simple joy of expanding. They aim better toys. A Lascanon team, bench-rested and reverent, lances him with a white-hot seam that eats tanks. The beam slides against a boundary as clear as glass, pools, oversaturates, diffracts into a rosette that sketches itself bright on low cloud. That is not to say he is invulnerable. It is to say energy meets condition and gets litigated. Plasma bolts, sun pieces corked in magnet bottles, arrive like impatient gods. He gives them a new god to worship. They bend, bloom, and paint his outline like icons paint halos. A melter blast, that hateful close-range whisper that tells atoms to forget each other, spits at his breast. The enchantments around him are stubborn friendship. Melter eats and leaves, scorch and smoke, but not a cavity where a god should be. Vehicles, those roaming shrines, enter the argument. A land raider with adamantine marrow and a machine spirit that has won battles by remembering them, locks its sponson heavy bolters and advances like a cathedral. He does not break its skull. He speaks to it in lightning. The arcs enter through antennae and auspex dishes, follow cabling like pilgrim roads, sit down in cogitator nests as if they were tired and wanted to stay. The ancestor spirit inside the tank feels something it has no schema for. Awe. Its motivators cough. Track assemblies lock like a jaw in a bad dream. The gunner's spirit lash bounces back from dead relays. He could tear it open with brute force. He chooses instead to crown it in rain, tap the glasses once and leave it sleeping. Mercy is a vector, too. Shields define higher tiers of argument. Knights and titans dress themselves in void, those humming, phase-skipping layers that convince reality to misplace your strike. Void shields despise duration more than amplitude. A volcano cannon's single trespass they can forget, but a needling persistence unthreads their patience. He gives them the worst enemy of all, time, arranged as storm. He lifts his hand and asks the entire sky to participate. Ion columns bloom. The shields, designed to reject instantaneous crimes, find themselves in a lawsuit without recess. They squeal, thin, buckle. A knight's carapace field flickers. It exposes one shoulder for the small cruelty of a moment, and he does not waste it. The hammer goes and returns And when it returns, the field is gone, and the knight takes a knee that sounds like a bell tower breaking. A warhound titan, quick, proud, tilts its headguns as if in affront, and paints him with turbo laser light. He answers with layered waveforms that ride their own reflections back, overfeeding the titan's capacitors until breaker runes ham down and the princeps howls across a forest of pain spikes. Could he fell a warlord with stubborn bolts of sky alone? Not quickly. He could cut its logistics, blind its princeps, make every step a negotiation with wet earth, and break the duel into a campaign. A god does not have to be fair. He has to be inevitable. Then there are minds. Psychers sniff him like wolves. A sanctioned choir girl puts out her small hand and tries to press upon him a smite, warp force compacted to a palm print of ruin. It hits something that is not a Geller field, but has the same contempt for intrusion. The witchlight gutters. Her nose bleeds. A librarian of the Astartes, oaths inked under his skin, tries subtler arts. A telekinetic seize on the hammer, not to own it, but to query its weight. The answer is refusal wrapped in politeness. The hammer behaves as if his will were made of paper, and it did not want to tear the paper. He tries again. The librarian is not weak, and force is cumulative. The storm tightens its circle. Mjolnir returns to his palm, and the librarian learns a terrible etiquette. Some tools are not tools but promises, and promises do not like being touched. The warp itself, that screaming ocean of want and metaphor, presses. It wants to categorize him, to say demon, and have him obey, to say soul, and have him belong. It cannot. His power does not taste like belief amplified into weapon, nor like natural law turned weird by proximity to thought. It tastes like weather with opinions. That is not immunity. Names are nets, and if the warp can braid one that fits, he will feel it. Zentian sorcery tests inscriptions and fails to anchor. Horn hates everything that is not a straight line to the kill, and finds irritation in not being able to declare him prey. Nurgle approves of nothing except decay, and decay does not know where to begin. Slaanesh finds grace in him, but not submission, and has no lever. The great ravening gods do not surrender. They remember. They lean. Nulls complicate him. A Colexus assassin steps from a shadow that did not exist until needed, the air around them as taste-free as a blank page. Stormsong falters. The rain loses its choir and becomes just water. He is still a giant of bone and intent. He is still the hammer and a lifetime of practice written into tendon and nerve. But the dialogue with the sky becomes monologue. He fights as men fight, with reach, timing, cutting the angles out from under an opponent whose aura is a hunger. He bleeds here, if he bleeds anywhere. Not much and not long, but the metaphysics that make him indecent now must work harder. Blackstone scratches him at a deeper level. It does not hurt him, not as Melter hurts tanks or grief hurts saints, but it makes parts of his power sit in the corner and be quiet. Against a Blackstone-lined keep, he is still a siege engine, just not a weather front. Xenos react as instruments and choirs. Eldar Farseers cast the wraith bone and watch skeins knot around him as if fate were wrapping a gift. Their runes scuttle like nervous insects when they try to map him onto Asuriani liturgy. He refuses. Their witchblades find him a poor meal, not because they cannot cut, but because the act of cutting a godling who belongs to a different grammar is imprecise, like trying to perform surgery with poetry. An autarch, practical as gravity, uses him anyway, shaping battles to draw his storms across the heads of demons her craft world hates. She knows better than to ask questions to which only men in cathedrals will give answers. Orcs are easier. They see the biggest, loudest lad in the storm, and their wah blossoms like mold on bread. Under his thunderstorms, their guns get luckier. Their trucks run longer on less promethium. Squigs develop lightning patterns on their hides and bite harder just because they want to. He does not intend this. The wah-ka is a field of belief that colonizes reality, and his presence is perfect compost. If he swings at them, they love him more. If he ignores them, they paint hammers on everything and start fights in his name. Power attracts worship, and worship breaks worlds by accident. Necrons are a study in disgust. Lightning wants to talk to metal. Living metal prefers monologues. Gauss weapons do not burn. They remind matter that it is a stack of reluctantly cooperative particles and encourage disassembly. He can shrug off seconds of flensing that would turn an Astartes into a clang and a smear. Minutes will tell. His armor and skin carry the stubbornness of story. The Thunder God does not rot. But Gauss is not rot. It is patience turned to math. He answers with arcs that seek joints in necrodermis, like water seeks cracks in stone. And there are cracks. Necron bodies are memory, and memory holds seams. Against tomb shields that phase like voids, he repeats the trick. Persistence over peak. A cryptek moves to counter with chronometric treachery, and discovers time is surprisingly loyal to thunder. At void and vacuum, he is comfortable the way a storm is comfortable on a mountaintop. He doesn't freeze. He doesn't boil. He throws himself across black water by telling Mjolnir where there is and allowing physics to be persuaded. Boarding actions are hateful, rust-stink confusion. He makes them clean. Macro shells pivot in mid-course and go home like ashamed dogs. Torpedoes find their gyros hearing a music they like better than orders. He is not a fleet by himself. He is an unscheduled variable that makes admirals invent new curse words. Mobility is cheating in a universe where distance murders plans. Teleportariums are ancient, dangerous, and jealous things. The webway is a secret that hates borrowers. The bridge that brought him is neither. When he wills it, a line appears, a shortest path drawn in light, and if the place he chooses can host weather, he arrives already welcome. He is not infinite. He is not a starship. He cannot translate whole armies or months of munitions. But a strike force with a storm in its pocket is worth more than a regiment with maps. Durability resists spectacle, but offers anecdotes. A volcano cannon splashes a sliver of star across him and leaves him smoking and superficially irritated, like a god with a bad temper. A demolisher shell catches him off balance and throws him through 3 hab blocks. He rises, the brick dust clinging to sweat like votive ash, and smiles a soldier's smile. A demon prince tries to catch his heart in a fist made of oaths and maggots. The fist closes around thunder and burns from the inside out. He can be staggered. He can be trapped for minutes by geometry he doesn't respect. He can be slowed by humble things, mud that loves him enough to hold him, nets woven by fishermen who prayed honestly. He is not exempt from the universe. He is simply very persuasive. Weapon output is where the forum arguments live. Numbers demand to be attached. How many gigajoules in a sky strike? How many void layers in a bad day? The cogboys draft equations with devotional headers and footnotes warning against blasphemous rounding. The answer, after all that incense, is qualitative. If he calls a storm that covers a continent, he can peel shields off hive spires like old paint. If he focuses instead on a single point, the knuckle of a knight's elbow, the toggle of a shield generator, the throat vent of a demon engine, he can make hard problems soft. Against planetary shields bolted to cathedral fortresses and fed by fusion stacks the size of neighborhoods, he cannot clap once and call it solved. He must take hours, sometimes days, arranging pressure and subtraction, telling wind to carry soot the wrong way, inviting salt into cracks, conscripting static as a fifth column. Skill is often left out of ledgers. He does not simply hit hard. He hits correctly. Mjolnir returns because the throw is a conversation he has been having for a very long time. He clips the rim of a Chaos Sorcerer's staff at the exact angle that turns spellwork into shrapnel. He strikes the ground not to break it, but to tell it to bounce. Enemy lines lose balance, and in that half-heartbeat of embarrassment, men discover they have already lost. He reads battle like sailors read cloud heights. He smells artillery. He knows when men will run. Politics is a form of power. An inquisitor puts a rosette against his breast and declares him saint or heresy by volume. The declaration changes armies. The ecclesiarchy tries hymns and finds the notes stick to him but do not sink in. The Adeptus Custodes do not smile and do not frown. One steps forward and they share an exchange no lexicon can hold, each measuring a law that is not written. Against a Primarch, were such beings to stride again, he would not be embarrassed. He would not be casual either. Against a greater demon, he would bleed, and if the fight lasted long enough, the warp would learn him too well for anyone's comfort. Limits exist. They always do. The storm loves him, which is not the same as slavish loyalty. On a dead world without air, he is less of himself. In a null-bathed black stone fortress, he is a man with a very good hammer and excellent knees. If he ever doubts in the particular way that shakes a foundation, if his hand hesitates when it should be absolute, Mjolnir would still be his. But not all of it would be available. Worthiness is an enchantment spelled in ethics, and ethics have failure modes. The 41st millennium is a machine built to manufacture such failures, and there are counters clever men will find. A warpsmith who has stared too long into broken reflections will lace a chain of grounded pylons across a field, so the storm must spend itself as heat and not as will. A Vindicar will wait 3 days for a shot that arrives just as he is speaking mercy, because mercy is when shoulders relax. A Guard artillery colonel will realize that you can't kill a thunderhead, but you can evacuate under it, fight elsewhere, deny it interesting topography. The galaxy, offended at being impressed, will cheat back. Measure him by what stops when he walks onto a field. Vox chatter curtails. Wards complain. Men forget to be ordinary. He is not an exterminatus button, not a sun in boots, not a singularity you point and pray at. He is a pressure system that rewrites odds. He turns the most important property in war, tempo, into his personal instrument and hands back minutes heavy as gold. If you need numbers, you can have a few. Strike force survivability doubles under his sky. Night kill times halve when he disorders their shields. Psyker miscast rates drop near him unless they are traitors, in which case they surge and kill their friends. Those are guesses dressed up as measurements. What matters is that when he lifts the hammer, even titans check their footing as if the ground had opinions. News travels in the Imperium, the way fire runs in dry grass, crooked, hungry, and faster than anyone approves. Within an hour of the storm bridge closing, there were already 3 versions of what had stepped out of it, and 2 of them used the word saint. The third used a word the Vox scribes refused to type, and that an Ordo Malleus seal later redacted into a black bar that looked like a bruise. The first uniforms to reach him were mud brown, not ceramite, line infantry, with eyes raw from promethium smoke and too many funerals. They came at a half crouch that said, "We don't want to die," and a straight spine that said, "We have been told to." The officer at their head wore a coat that had started life in a different regiment, and an aquila pin polished with the same cloth that cleaned his laspistol. He raised a hand, then lowered it, having nothing to command that made sense. "Identify yourself," he tried, "because words are procedures, and procedures keep men standing." The stranger looked at the hand first, then the man behind it. "Thor," he said, like a good introduction in a bad place. He did not add rank or title. He did not explain worlds or pantheons. The name fell into the dust and sat there, heavy as a slug of lead. Savan heard it through a dozen relay distortion fields and typed it phonetically, because anything else felt like forgery. Scarlet Vector 12, linked into half the hive's instruments, marked the waveform of that syllable. No empiric flare, no mimetic hook, no binding cadence. A name that behaved like a name and not a spell. He disliked that. He preferred names to commit crimes he could diagram. On the wall above, a preacher with a voice like a rasped nail inhaled to proclaim. The sisters at his shoulders touched his sleeve and shook their helmed heads a fraction. He swallowed the proclamation and bent it into a prayer under his breath. Adepta sororitas know when words become fuel. They held their tongues and their bolters. The next uniforms were wolf-shouldered. Space wolves do not arrive so much as become the center of wherever they are. A spearhead from the Root Company had been holding Carax's eastern approach for months on a diet of thin glory and thicker mud. The sudden opportunity to investigate a warrior of storm sagas boiled their blood in a way they tried and failed to hide. Their pack leader hopped down the broken steps of the wall with a grin like a split in rock. Frost etched the teeth of the axe on his back as if pleased to be nearer the weather. "You smell like home," he said, big mouth full of the heresy's oldest accent as he slid his helm to his belt. "And not much in this age does." Thor considered him, and the men behind him who would do what he did without argument. "You smell like war," he replied, "and much in this age does." They made a circle out of habit, the wolves, the guard, the sisters, Scarlet with 3 mechadendrites pretending to be still. And in that circle the Astartes offered tests the way dogs offer tails. The pack leader took a knee, not in worship but in practical recognition that looking up at a man while unhelmed from too close is how you get your jaw broken, and put down an oath stone. "A courteous thing," he said, for first words among strangers. He tapped his chest. "Jorund half-tied, wolf guard, spear brother to Bran. Say you came from the sky. Say your quarrel. Say whether you take ale." A laugh from the traitor lines, too far away to matter, came thinly across the plain. Something thudded burning into the dirt 100 meters away. Neither man glanced. Thor looked at the stone like it was a familiar custom in a foreign kitchen. "I came on a road," he said. "I quarrel with those who make roads into chains. I take ale." The hammer's head rested in the dirt. He did not lean on it. Weapons are not furniture, and furniture is not a promise. Jorund nodded, satisfied by everything except the part that mattered. Was this man a demon politely dressed? That was when the black gunship carved a too neat path through fat rain and set down with the overcaution of pilots who have seen too much wreath smoke in their mirrors. The hatch dropped with the usual theatre. Inquisitors know the value of silhouette. This one came with a retinue like a thesis on fear, a rosette on a chain that had never been polished, a gas-masked savant scribbling everything, a pair of storm coats with needle pistols held the way you hold your breath, and a sister dialogus walking 2 steps behind, translating a dozen arguments into poised silence in case any of them became law. "Stand aside," said the Inquisitor, because Inquisitors enter conversations exactly the way they enter rooms. He was Ordo Malleus if you were a betting man. The sigil on his shoulder tasted of banishment prayers and careful paranoia. He swept the scene with a professional disgust that liked things in folders. By authority of the Lex Imperialis and the Most Holy Ordos, this manifestation is under sanction and investigation. All witnesses are to submit testimony and submit to purity scans. Non-compliance is heresy. Confessor, still your tongue. Tech priest, keep your limbs away from the artifact. Scarlet froze in the particular offensiveness of being told the truth. Jorund's grin flexed. "It breathes," he said, nodding at Thor. "Artifacts don't." "They breathe fire," the Inquisitor returned without looking at him. He planted his seal in the air between himself and the storm god, the way sailors plant an oar in unstable sand. "Entity, you will declare fealty to the master of mankind and submit to right absolutio and the warrant of binding. You will relinquish any unnatural armament for examination by the Mechanicus under my oversight. You will consent to a verification duel under controlled conditions or be annihilated." The storm dwindled a shade, as if to hear better. Thor's face did not change, but the men closest felt the pressure of the air lean forward a hair. "You prefer commands to questions," he said, tone mild enough to be dangerous without trying. "What if we begin with a smaller thing? What is fealty when the one you name is not here?" "He is always here," said the confessor, voice ragged with a sudden confidence he didn't know he had. "He is the light by which they see you." "The light is there," Thor said, glancing upward to where the clouds boiled like a ceiling with thoughts. "You may borrow it." The Sister Dialogus did not translate that for anyone. Everyone had understood it, and would now claim they hadn't. Sister Helix arrived like a fever abating, pallid and precise, 2 black-robed novices at her elbows, and the smell of burned frankincense still drying in her hair. She looked smaller outside her sanctum, but her eyes could measure terrain. She carried a scroll tube with astropathic seals and a headache that would paralyze a lesser mind. "He does not read as sorcery," she said, before the Inquisitor could pour the scene into wax. "He reads as constraint." She chose the word carefully and hated it. "He imposes an order. It is not ours, but it is order." "The demon of the straight line," the Inquisitor murmured, annoyance sharpening into interest. "That is still a demon." And if he is an incarnation from the Emperor's unused alphabets, came a new voice, dry as vellum. A canoness of the Order of the Sacred Rose, silver hair braided like a reliquary chain, stepped into rain that respectfully avoided her boots. She had been lurking behind the Inquisitor's theatre, because all good theatre has a second act. Her palatine shadowed her like a blade. "Thorians dream of vessels," she went on, almost smiling at the name in a way that made the Inquisitor's molars complain. Perhaps not the dream they wanted. But the ecclesiarchy does not throw away good miracles. "Your miracle crippled 3 batteries and stopped a traitor push," Jorund put in, counting casualties in the way soldiers count. "Friends first, then ammunition, then the enemy. If you wish tests, let them be honest. Not crates and candles, blades and breath." Scarret recovered a sliver of courage and put a brass hand into the discussion. "There are also machine considerations," he said, with the tone of a man pleading sanity at a brawl. "The apparent hammer is an apotheosis of patterned energies. My rubrica indicate a compliant, perhaps sentient, machine spirit of distinction." He swallowed. "It may be unwilling to, visit our shrines." "Your shrines," Thor said, turning to him with a look that was not unkind, "are homes for the dead. This one lives." He rested the head of the hammer on his palm, as if balancing a sleeping animal. "It loves to be used correctly." "So do you." Scarret made a sound machine priests make when they experience something dangerously close to flattery. The argument unraveled into the only piece the Imperium respects, a schedule. They would host a trial by combat to test for corruption, madness, and monkish euphorias. The ritual would be named and sanctified and observed by a matched triad, Ministorum, Ordo, Astartes, so that no faction could later claim they hadn't been looking when the crime occurred. The Mechanicus would hum and pretend not to watch too closely. The guard would form a perimeter. The traitors would be allowed to lick their wounds and reorganize, because war is a gentleman who bows to formalities only when it hurts someone else. They made a ring on packed mud that had been kissed by lightning and remembered. At the ring's edge, a sister hospitaller laid out bandages with the calm of a woman who has learned to bandage what cannot be bandaged. Savin found himself drafted as a scribe because his hands were steady, and someone liked the adjectives he chose when scared. He watched the wolves strip to undersuits and paint old runes on fresh skin. He watched the Inquisitor's acolytes sprinkle powdered silver in a circle and whisper the dullest liturgies they knew. Dull liturgies don't trip traps. He watched Scarret place 3 sensoria at cardinal points and light little censers for the benefit of machine spirits that enjoyed smoke. The chosen Astartes stepped into the ring with the casual gravity of a man used to being the point at which things change direction. He was not Jorund. He was older and quieter, armor handoff to the tech marine, a frost axe with filigree like winter's handwriting cradled in his palm. His hair was iron, his jaw scarred with a story no one told twice. He introduced himself to Thor by making a small bow that was unnecessary and absolutely right. "Hroth Ulfsbane," he said, "I will test your edges. If you fail, you will not suffer. If I fail, I will fail correctly." Thor nodded, eyes crinkling in a way that made 2 guardsmen posthumously forgive absent fathers. "I have fought men who thought their glory and men who knew their duty," he said. "You will be the second." They agreed to terms that were mostly traditions wrapped in respect. No killing unless the warp insisted. No psycho tricks from the peanut gallery. The ring was the world. The hammer was permitted. The axe was permitted. Fists were, as always, welcomed by God and physics. When they moved, it was without signal. Hroth came forward on his toes, letting the axe head drag a little through the dirt, so that it threw grit into Thor's eyes if he watched it, and into his ankles if he didn't. Thor didn't watch it. He watched Hroth's breath change speed as he committed weight. The first exchange was an argument about distance. The axe wanted a forearm's length plus tradition. The hammer enjoyed the full parabola of departure and return. Hroth stepped inside the idea of the hammer, shouldered with the weight of a man who had tackled orcs out of trucks for sport, and tried a short, ugly chop toward the knee. Thor let the chop eat air, and answered with the haft, not the head, because a rib taught a lesson, and a broken rib wrote it in capitals. Hroth's breath huffed. He grinned instead of frowning. They spoke in beats most men don't hear. The wolves-helmed spectators cocked their heads in unison as footwork told stories. 3/4 steps to bait overcommitment, a heel dig to announce a feint to the intelligent and mislead the proud, a hop precisely when lightning cracked so that thunder hid the sound. Thor's style was a sin against the Codex Astartes and every other book that prefers squares to circles. He used the weather as a third limb and the ground as a fourth. Hroth's was so honest it came out the other side of obvious. He hit where men had been hit 1,000 years ago because it still works, and he presented fewer opportunities than the average wall. The hammer left Thor's hand once, twice, 3 times, each on a different rhythm. The first throw tested Hroth's willingness to trust his armor. He did, and the head clanged like a bell against plate and returned annoyed with itself. The second sought the axe, kissing its edge and sending tingle up a veteran's forearm that made even an Astartes want to swear. The third passed so near the Inquisitor's shoulder that his bodyguard's trigger fingers wrote treaties with their muscles. On the fourth, Thor didn't throw. Hroth expected it. He swung through the empty expectation as if it had been a man and clipped Thor's pauldron. The storm muttered. Rain thickened. Hroth respected the complaint. He pulled power off his next swing and fed it to his footwork instead. Then Hroth altered a habit a hair's breadth, and everything turned on that hair. He always circled clockwise because the axe's weight sings better that way. He went counter. Thor read the song change, and in the microsecond that he rewrote intention, Hroth did an ugly, unsaga-worthy thing. He kicked the knee he'd been pretending not to love. It landed true. Thor went down on one leg, not pain so much as physics, and the wolves on the ring edge howled because they are not stupid, and they know timing when they see it. Thor laughed, the open, reckless kind of laugh that only men who have fallen off taller things can afford. He rolled with the fall and caught himself on one hand, the other bringing the hammer around in a cut that wasn't designed for people with intestines. Hroth hiked his hip to take it on the plate and let it spend itself. The world flashed. The smell of hot iron got opinionated. Hroth straightened, and both of them took 2 steps back because their bodies' gods demanded it. Scarrit's Sensoria sang. Sister Helix, lips moving on a private litany, kept her mind steady against what her senses wanted to call joy. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed, and then, against his better reputation, softened a fraction as he watched for the telltales of possession, leakage, insistence, other voices. He saw a man exerting will rather than a will exerting a man. That was a distinction that made him more uneasy, not less. The end of such duels is always the same shape, even when the colors differ. Exhaustion is a paint all men share. Hroth's breath thickened despite twin hearts. Thor's shoulder carried an ache that would bloom later when glory cooled. The axe bit once, cleanly, and left a stripe of blood like a signature across armor that did not bleed often. The hammer tapped Hroth's helm just hard enough to ring his ears like wedding bells. They both understood then that the measurement had been taken. Hroth lowered his axe first, not in surrender, but in the recognition of a complete thought. He tilted his head and, without ceremony, put knuckles to the oath stone. "He is not a liar," he said, and the air seemed to accept the statement and file it. The canoness nodded, as if the conclusion had only reminded her of work. "If we must call him something before the arguing begins, call him useful," she said. "Some titles behave better than others." The Inquisitor didn't sheath his authority. Men like him do not put tools away while they're still warm. But he allowed his voice to lose the edge it uses to cut people into compliance. "Provisional status," he said to the waiting scribes and servo skulls. "Witnessed combatant under observation, Class PCO. Rights to act in defense of Imperial assets while investigation proceeds. Tech Priest, you may ask your questions. Do not demand answers. Confessor, you may write your sermons. Do not publish them. Sister, you will walk near him and sing without moving your lips." Jorund clapped Hroth's shoulder hard enough to knock dust off pride. He turned to Thor with a broad grin that showed young in an old face. "There's ale in the fort that doesn't taste like admitting defeat. Come drink it. Then we'll see if the sagas want you or if we have to make our own." Thor glanced up at the cliff of Hive Wall, where men had stacked their lives and found them wanting, then out across the plain to where traitor banners hunched in rain. The storm curved its back like a cat prepared to either sleep or kill something that had made the mistake of moving. He nodded once. "Drink," he agreed, with the small, feral smile of a soldier who knows that piety and thirst can share a cup. Then work. High above, on Gloria Mortis, the navigator returned to her charts and inked in a line that had not existed yesterday, a line she did not think she could walk twice. In a file-stuffed office half a sector away, an Amalathian Inquisitor flicked ash off a candle and wrote to a Thorian rival, "We may have something that will ruin both of us." In a shrine under a hab stack, a woman who had decided last week never to pray again found her hands making the sign regardless. In the cogitator guts of a land raider, a machine spirit hummed a new interval and dreamed of thunder. Scarlet approached the hammer the way a good priest approaches a skittish animal, head bowed slightly to avoid the insult of eye contact as a challenge. "May I?" he began, and stopped there, because asking to touch a miracle is a greater arrogance than touching without asking. "It will tell you what it is," Thor said, offering nothing and everything. "Listen to be told, not to learn." Scarlet nodded, understanding and not, and extended a thread of not heat, not light, a quiet handshake in machine dirge. The hammer did not speak in the noosphere. It spoke on the skin. A spark jumped to his brass knuckle and wrote a single character there in soot that flaked away and left no mark except a memory of warmth. The tech priest's eyes widened a machine millimeter. He had not been burned. He had been greeted. The ring dissolved. Orders began to grow like mold where silence had kept them from sprouting. The guard rechecked perimeters with the renewed cruelty hope lends to boredom. The sisters rotated prayer duty with disciplined envy. The wolves used the old jokes you save for men you consider yours. The Inquisitor sent thin, encrypted pulses into the air that landed on hard desks and started fights in rooms with too many seals on the doors. At the edge of the plain, in the first fat puddles the rain had kindly allowed to survive the battlefield's thirst, the water rippled under small feet. A group of underhive children, led by the girl who could only count to 1 between thunder and lightning, stared through a broken drain and watched the big men do complicated things with simple weapons. One of them held a scrap of tin with a carved two-headed eagle and asked in a whisper if that man with the hammer was a saint. "He's a storm," the girl said, as if she knew weather better than catechisms. "Saints are for later. The warp is a bad listener, with infinite patience." It heard the hush that fell when the storm bridge closed, tasted the order stitched into the thunder, and leaned closer like a drunk at the end of a bar, smiling with too many teeth. On Hellwinter 9, the rain thickened honestly over the plain. In the Empyrean above it, rain took on opinions. Every drop acquired a possibility. Blood, mercury, ash, glass, and tried those skins on as it fell. The sky made up its mind again and never kept it for long. In the trench temples where the heretics warmed their hands over brass icons, the first answers came fast and contradictory. A cornate champion nailed 9 skulls into a circle and called the storm a challenge. A Zentkian sorcerer unrolled maps of futures like a cheating gambler and called it a lever. A Nurgle blessed host watched the rain bead on sores that never closed and called it weather, which is to say, family. Slaaanesh's faithful took the first thunderclap as percussion and tuned their cruelty to it. One of them did more than shout at the sky. Word-bearers wear scripture the way other men wear skin. Their dark apostle arrived in a procession of censers and chained books dragged through mud, his voice already braided with an echo that wasn't his. He held up a Crozius that had preached cities to death and made a sermon of naming. Names are nets. If you can get the first loop around a thing, the rest will cinch themselves in time. "Storm with a face," he intoned, syllables picked for the way they hooked thought. "Take the name the gods have prepared for you. Be wrath's herald. Be oath breaker. Be sky betrayer. Be bound weather." The storm shivered, in the mind more than in the air. Sister Halix, sitting in her sanctum with a cloth pressed against one bleeding nostril, felt the pressure of meanings trying to pick a lock. She forced her choir into a simple psalm, an old one whose notes were like straight roads from village to village. Order is a lane you can walk with your eyes shut. The song didn't repel the attempt. It gave Thor a rail to hold while the warp tugged. He stood on the plain, and the rain bowed around him in a neat circle a child could have traced with a bowl. The wolves glanced at the sky with the suspicious affection men give to a friend who drinks too much. Jorund spat and tightened a gauntlet. "They're trying to name you," he said, helmet vox running warm. "Don't let them." "I have a name," Thor said, as if it were a shield you could sling and forget until it did its work. He lifted his hammer, and the thunder remembered what a downbeat was. That was the first time the warp flinched, not from injury, but from insult. It despises straight lines that keep being straight when you're not looking. Khorne does not flinch. He arrives in momentum and stays there until everything quiet is dead. The first blood offering had been copious. Hellwinter 9 had provided a decade's worth in an afternoon. The blood god's attention was a red weight on the world, low and impatient. The ground beneath the traitor trench heaved, and an iron tower shouldered its way up. No, not iron. On closer inspection, fused bone and hammered brass pretending to be architecture. Chain banners yawned wetly. Something on the other side of sight exhaled furnace heat, and the rain hissed on it like angry cats. A demon prince took a step into real space, the way a verdict steps into a courtroom. Brass grew where his feet touched, a scab of reality already half-healed. He was not a bloodthirster, whose arrival is the end of the conversation. He was a man who had been promoted for reasons including talent and including crimes, and you could see the human stub in him if you knew where to look. The way his axes were balanced to the finger width, the way his head cocked before he spoke, as if listening for a sergeant's shout that would never come again. Spikes like the signature of a bad artist rose from his shoulders. His name sounded like a door slammed on a vowel. He said it anyway, because names have momentum too. "Korvax," he announced, and thunder rolled as if asked for applause. Jorun's teeth showed. "Finally," he breathed, in the tone of a man denied a good fight by bureaucrats. The Inquisitor lifted a hand without looking at him. "Contain," he said to no one in particular, and everyone within earshot. "Hexagrammic cordons. Fire at will if the thing addresses you by your true name or offers you a contract." Korvax was not here to bargain. He laughed, which in the air tasted like old pennies and hot fat. "Little storm," he said to Thor, contempt layered over curiosity. Curiosity because contempt is a bad scout, and nobody likes to walk blind. "Thunder counts heads as trophies. Bring me your hammer. We'll hang it in a hall of good deaths." Thor's answer did not have syllables a cornate ear wanted. He put the head of Mjolnir to his palm, and the sky stopped fidgeting long enough to remember that lightning goes down, not sideways. The first strike peeled a chain banner to threads and drove the wet smell of meat into the trench. Korvax came forward at a long, happy stride that would have been fast even without favor. His axes traced crescents that made the rain stand back. Sparks came off the blades and ran up into the storm, as if happy to go home. They met in a noise that did not belong to any musical scale. The first exchange was honest. Mass, reach, the handshake of men who do not shake hands. The second was already treachery. Korvax's offhand axe sang 3 syllables that were not words, and the blade ate light. Mjolnir struck it and left no dent and took no scratch, but the air around the impact delaminated into layers that did not remember each other. Thor's circle collapsed inward. Rain fell crooked. Thunder developed an echo that did not wait for sound. The warp had found a seam in his weather and tugged. Sister Helix tightened her jaw until little bones clicked in their sockets. In her mind, a map unfolded. Storm fronts as clauses in a sentence, pressure systems as promises, isobars as litanies. She started to pray in the grammar of meteorology. Let the warm air rise. Let the cold air descend. Let the front pass. Let the high linger. Her choir repeated it until it became a metronome for lungs. Korvax pushed when the echo stuttered. He fought like a man who had been applauded for a particular cruelty and never had to learn another, which is to say beautifully in a narrow way. He took injuries as investments, traded flesh for position, and spent indifferently because the bank in the warp never closes. One axe caught Thor's wrist and hissed along a bracer, trying to tell the metal that it was tired of being contiguous. The warp forge in the weapon knew exactly how to say disintegrate in a dozen dialects. The answer it received was rude and monosyllabic. Worthiness is not a force field, it is a condition that insists. The blade bit, scratched, sulked, and did not write its argument into the story. On the heretic flank, the Tsentkian sorcerer saw the problem and offered a solution. He had 3 faces, one for prayer, one for arithmetic, one for lying to his own reflection. He knelt, which for a sorcerer is just a different kind of standing, and traced an array with a finger that left unlight behind like slug trail. Runes deployed like carrion birds. He did not try to seize the storm. He tried to interpret it. Interpretation is ownership. He began to persuade probability into a better mood, sliding small accidents under Thor's feet. A stone that wasn't there, a timing that overslept, a muscle that forgot the second half of a contraction. Mjolnir left his hand and came back half a blink later than it should have, which is how men die. Jorund felt it in the itch that announces bad outcomes and snapped a command on his pack channel. 3 long fangs on the wall tilted missile racks, and the world learned the old harmony of crack and rain. 2 missiles thumped, one corkscrewed off into bad statistics. The sorcerer grinned with all his faces at once and lifted a hand to savor the miss. The 3rd missile, unnoticed and dull as bread, came low and late and took him in the spine. There are futures so small they escape even the god of change when he is looking at the tall ones. The array sputtered, and his runes went looking for a different argument to sit under. Korvax tried words again, because words are also weapons, and Horn does not forbid them. He simply asks that they be pointy. "You were made for killing," he growled, leaning his weight into a bind meant to break elbows. "Your joy is the swing. Give it without judge's pretense. Be honest in red." "I was made," Thor said through his teeth, "for more than you can hold." Slaanesh arrived not as a person, but as a clarity. The thunder perfected itself until it rang with unbearable precision, the rhythm of blows aligned with a human heartbeat. There is a pleasure that lives where competence and timing meet, and the world becomes a soft room for your edges to fit into. The Prince of Excess offered that forever. A fight with no fatigue, no ache, no cost. Impact after impact solving themselves so elegantly that each begged for the next. You could drown in that. Many champions have. Thor felt it in the long cord that thrummed when Mjolnir struck chain, and the chain sang back in tune. He could live there. He could pour himself into that canyon and listen to the echo return and call it purpose. He mistimed a parry on purpose. The jolt up his forearm was ugly and useful. Pain is a lane marker, too. Nurgle, last because he is never in a hurry, bloomed at the margins. Flies arrived from places with no meat and showed interest in rain. The ground stopped being mud and started being a digestive process. Cuts that should have bled bright were denied drama. The edges turned grey, then green, and then began to forget they were ever edges. A pox priest waddled forward with the authority of a chef and shook a clapper in a bell made of fused vertebrae. "It is all right," he told the world, voice like warm bread molding. "Lay down." Endings are soft. Thor's storm balked. Decay is a law too, older than empires and very proud of itself. Lightning hates pride that isn't its own. He shut his eyes for the length of a breath and remembered disciplines that have nothing to do with muscle. Pressure gradient, dew point, lapse rate. He arranged the air as if it were a room he wanted children not to trip in. The flies lost interest. The bell tolled and the sound went straight into the ground, like a secret, and never came back. The duel with Korvax turned. The demon prince had been getting what he wanted, weight on weight, trade on trade, until the storm found its center again, and the echoes stopped slouching. Korvax pushed once more into that simple, obstinate circle and discovered something Khorne seldom bothers to teach: denial. Mjolnir did not meet him where he was. It met him where he had already spent himself, and because the warp is patient but not generous, it did not refund the purchase. The hammer struck the horned pauldron, staggered him into a stumble that looked like a bow without the dignity, and followed with a crack across the jaw that made the red light gutter in his eye pits. Rain slid off brass as if ashamed to touch it. He roared, beautiful, uncomplicated, a cathedral of rage with busted windows. He threw both axes, trusting their return the way men trust gravity. Thor cut one out of the air so finely it turned into a line of sparks that wrote and unwrote an alphabet as they fell. The other he caught on the rim of the hammerhead, turned it like a bad idea away from a friend, and let it spin into the mud where it bred rust on contact. Korvax came with his fists, because fists have fewer betrayals in them than tools. They met again and again in small, efficient car crashes. The word-bearer, bleeding out and delighted because pain is praise, kept naming. He had moved on to epithets that tried to make Thor smaller by making him refracted. Storm that serves, chain judge, hammer priest, lightning warden. Sister Helix felt one of them almost catch warden, because duty is a chain even when you are the one who made it. She sang louder without moving her lips. Her novices bled from the ears and didn't stop breathing because she was looking at them, and examples matter. Black gouts of shot from the heretic left announced the arrival of a warpsmith and his pet engines. The guns had mouths. They complained as they fired. The warpsmith had threaded inductors through his nerves so that rage and current were synonyms to his body. He took a survey of the field with the brisk disdain of an engineer at a church social, and erected pylons by slamming rods into mud. Each rod woke a ring of dirty light and began to drink lightning with a greedy sound. The storm tilted toward them as iron tilts a compass needle. He was making a grounded cage, the kind you build around a tantrum so it tires itself out. Scarlet Vector 12 swore in lingua technis, which to the untrained ear sounds like servos choking. "They are stealing our god," he said, and immediately wished he had used a less honest pronoun. He ran a mechadendrite into a klaxon's heart, hijacked its diaphragm, and beat a code into the air for the knights on the ridge. The giants do not like clocks that tell them what to do, but they like warpsmiths less. Their ion shields curled inward to make small weather around themselves, and then strode, careful as men carrying sleeping infants, to stamp on the rods that were making bad music. Korvax saw the pylons too, and redoubled violence to keep the duel where he could feel it. Thor gave him one more trade he wanted, then took everything else he had. The hammer rose. The storm leaned. Mjolnir fell not as a blow, but as a summary. Brass split. The sound rang off the hive wall and came back righteous. The demon prince, who had been a man and then an idea, became a man again for the length of a scream, and then became a stain that tried to boil and failed because the rain did not permit it. The warp's attention did not retreat. Attention is not the same as presence. It is a ledger. Tzeentch took a note in a color that does not exist and filed it where it files tools it cannot yet steal. Slaanesh sighed, not displeased, and tucked away a rhythm, the exact spacing between the third and fourth strikes, for a later seduction. Nurgle patted the field with fatherly fondness. The mud had done its best, and went back to his garden humming. Khorne tilted his head, and for once counted. If there is a number the blood god respects, it is totals. Out on the flank, something laughed from behind a non-existent tree. A Cacodominus-type warp entity tried to pronounce Thor in a language made of angles and failed, coming away with a mouthful of static. The failure didn't discourage it. Failure in the warp is only rehearsal. The pylons cracked under night feet and spilled light the way broken eggs spill truth. The warpsmith died how men like him die, doing mathematics with his hands when he should have been running. The storm came back to itself with the resentful shiver of a beast pulled out of a trap by strangers it does not trust yet. Thor breathed once, long, and let the hammer hang for a moment longer than pride would advise. Hrothulfsbane took one involuntary step forward and then stopped, because courtesy is a muscle too, and his was trained. "Mark him," the Inquisitor said softly, into a channel that went a very long way. Not as asset, as variable. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his rosette and didn't notice that he was doing it. He is not inside our book. Write him in the margins and expect the scribe to complain. In the sanctum, Sister Halix steadied her choir and considered a thing she had been trying not to think since the bridge split the sky. The warp can learn. If it cannot name him now, it will keep trying. It will taste his cadence, lick his timing, memorize how he holds his breath before the heavy strikes. A year from now, in some other war, a sorcerer will whistle the first 3 notes of this fight, and a storm somewhere will turn its head. That is how the Empyrean owns you, first with fear, then with familiarity. Under the wall, the Underhive girl counted between flash and boom, and for the first time since the storm arrived, said 2. She did not know what that meant. She would remember it when she was old, and call it faith if anyone asked. Word of the storm reached ears that were not human long before the Voxnet knitted itself back together. On a craft world that refused to speak its name aloud in case the galaxy remembered it, a farseer traced an old circle on a floor of singing bone and spilled a handful of runes. They struck the wraithbone like raindrops on a drum. Some bounced, some stood on edge. One split and became 2. She watched them in the long, unblinking way of a hunter watching wind. "Amon Kiev God Spark," she said at last, not unkindly. Not daemon, not machine. A storm that insists warlocks shifted, uncomfortable with an insistence that wasn't theirs. The autarch at her shoulder folded a map until it was all edges and points. "If it must insist," he murmured, "let us show it where." The skein over Hell Winter 9 looked like a knot tied by a dying hand, too tight in places, slack in others, red with chaos where it bled into the Empyrean. The farseer pressed a nail to the knot's heart. A calling wound. If left to sing, it will learn the thunder's name. We will not let it. She didn't say, protect the humans. She didn't say doom the humans. She said, aim the storm at the wound. Rangers broke atmosphere an hour later, as if it were brittle glass, riding heat shadows into the hive's blind angles. They appeared where no auspex expected, on a spire lip that Wind had forgotten, on a cathedral buttress that had seen more ash than prayer. One left a token the size of a thumbnail in an alley near a guard medica tent. A wraithbone leaf veined like a palm. Savan, the junior Vox officer with talent for adjectives, found it while trying to remember whether he had eaten. When he touched it, the world stepped aside half a thumb's width, and a voice arrived without sound. If you wish your storm to hurt what deserves hurt, meet us where the factory roof is broken like teeth. The message did not ask for trust. It offered a direction because directions are cheaper than trust. The meeting place overlooked Manufactura, whose machines hadn't cooled in a century. Heat rose in waves. Jorund, Wulfgard Grin turned down to a polite warning, came with 2 pack brothers and a bolter that had had its name longer than most marriages. Sister Helix came because no one had told her not to, and because psychers are kites that fly better in wind. The Inquisitor sent 2 acolytes with orders to listen and remember badly. Thor came last, as if the sky were unwilling to let him out of its sight. The Eldar did not arrive so much as stop hiding. A Farseer stepped out of a sheet of heat wobble, runes orbiting her fingers like obedient moths. A pair of rangers ghosted the parapet, long rifles aimed at nothing and everything. A bone singer in bark pale armor set a palm to a cracked girder and sighed at the ugliness of human welding. "Tempest Caller," the Farseer said, in low Gothic that tasted like a language she'd polished for a long time. "Your storm stands in a place with too many names. If it stays, it will acquire one of them." Her gaze flicked to the sister. "The wrong one." "Make your case," Jorund said, because he had decided a while ago to enjoy hating Eldar and didn't want to revise a good decision without good reason. She sketched a windrose in the oily dust, real air, falling pressure, heat engines, and atop them, faint lines that were not meteorology but wanted to be. Warp currents, sorcerous spill, the breath of a wound. "There," she said, tapping the spot where the lines converged like cracks in enamel. "A nascent gate, small and sly. They feed it with blood and proper nouns. If you fold the storm along these vectors, you can press it shut. Do nothing, and it will name the thunder and call it again." Thor crouched to look, big hands loose over his knees. The symbols meant nothing to him and everything. Storm logic is simple when you stop arguing with it. "If I do this," he said without looking up, "children in the lower stacks do not die because you love angles more than people." The Farseer's mouth compressed in a way that suggested old losses that weren't all human. "No more than already scheduled," she said, then amended, "fewer, if we succeed." A warlock behind her shifted at the word scheduled, but said nothing. The autarch's silence was taut as bowstring. He had already begun counting aspect, shrines, and ammunition, and how much grace he could waste on Mon Kij if it bought him a clean cut at chaos. A ripple of laughter, like a blade sliding off silk, moved through the heat. A figure stepped where there had been nothing, motley that didn't need dye to look like starlight, a mask with a smile painted as a question, a shadow seer of the Harlequins, which is to say, a prophecy with legs. "A storm with manners," they chimed from inside the mask, head cocked at Thor. Rare. Keep them. You will need them where you are going. The Inquisitor's acolytes reached for pistols, and then, without quite realizing why, reached for nothing. The Shadowseer drew a card from the air, showed it, a tower struck by lightning, lovers embracing under it, a crown falling, and let it burn without heat. This act ends with applause and blood, they said helpfully, and stepped sideways into an absence. The Farseer did not wince. She did not need theater. She needed momentum. While aliens offered maps and koans on a roof, the cult Mechanicus did what it always does when confronted by the unfiled. It filed. In the Shrine Forge Annex, 3 levels down, Scarlet Vector 12 stood between Mjolnir and colleagues with more seals than patience. The hammer rested on a block of basalt that had served as a plinth for saints' bones and machine lords' hands. Around it hovered censer-wreathed servitors, incense stacked in static currents. A chorus of datacantats muttered at harmonics, calculated by men who believed numbers behave when frightened. Magos Dominus Ferrum Lex arrived with a cortege of Skitarii, and the kind of authority that assumes all problems are screws, and he is a hammer. "Begin the rite of nested numbers," he pronounced. "Let the aperture interrogate the artifact." Full spectrum. No touching would come later, of course, when the sage safety of not touching had done its polite theater. Scarlet swallowed several objections and kept the important one. "With respect, Dominus, he responds poorly to interrogation. Better to ask permission," Ferrum Lex sneered gently. "We do not ask relics permission. We audit them." He gestured, and blue-white cones of scanning light laced the hammer in a grid. For half a breath, the forge sang pleasantly. Then every bell in the annex rang once in a note no bell had been taught. Runes that indicated ready, inverted to indicate regret. The shrine's machine spirit executed a protocol no one had installed. Shutters slammed, warding glyphs flipped from invitation to injunction, and a voice like a patient grandfather spoke from every wall in lingua technis and low Gothic at once. Protocol 9, apotheotic unknown, litany of silence, all vault keys to ground, all tongues to stillness. Ferrum Lex's expression moved through surprise into offense. "Over," he began, and a neat, well-timed spark hopped from Mjolnir to the relay he had been about to touch. His gauntlet servos locked in place, as if the machine spirit had decided that hands needed to think before acting. No damage. All message. Scarlet did not smile. His flesh mouth and vox grill spoke in chorus. "Listen to be told, not to learn," he reminded softly, and the hammer hummed once, a contented animal acknowledging a familiar hand. The Dominus glared at Scarlet as if betrayal were a contagion, and he had coughed. Up in the broken light, Thor set his palm over the windrose. The lines of heat and sorcery glowed as if inked with ion. "I can do this," he said. "I can hold the air in a way it wants to be held." He glanced at Sister Halix. "You will sing, so the wrong music cannot borrow the storm." She nodded once, already calculating breath control, choir rotation, the psalms that sounded most like straight corridors. "And we," the autarch said, "will cut the hands feeding the wound." He gestured, and the world sharpened. Dire avengers with helms like angry tears, swooping hawks gathering to ride thermals that were delighted to hold them, striking scorpions fading into shadow like sleep. The Farseer's spear tip wrote small corrections in the air, adjusting where reality was a half step out of tune with intention. "We will keep your storm from learning our names," she added to Thor, and for an instant there was a thin wire of mutual respect between two professionals who had to do an ugly thing well. Far away, green thunder answered blue. The first orcs did not so much arrive as assemble out of appetite and spare parts. A freebooter hulk that had been sniffing the system for loot twitched its course when a weird boy on its deck went cross-eyed and started to foam lightning. "Something tasty," the weird boy hissed, eyes full of weather. "Something big." The captain licked a gold tooth, ordered all guns forward, and started shouting for hats with bigger feathers. In 3 smaller systems around Hellwinter Poids, boys already quarreling over petrol, teeth, and the privilege of riding the red truck heard thunder from a clear sky and agreed to disagree somewhere else, specifically wherever the thunder was thickest. The Wach doesn't travel by ship when it has a better road. It travels by idea. They called him what they needed to call him. The Thunder Boss, Boss Boom, the Big Wallop. Orcs are precise where it matters. The best fights are near the loudest noise. A war boss with a jaw like a toolbox and a name full of Ks declared a crusade and a style guide. Lightning bolts painted on everything, red where red would help, yellow on the guns because yellow makes you rich and rich guns shoot more. Storm boys discovered their rockets misfired less under a friendly sky. Friendly because the storm liked anyone who committed. Weird boys thickened the air with green until static crawled along teeth and turned squigs into little mad lanterns. A mech with ambition built a zap pole, which was a totem of copper wire, dreams, and a stolen Geller coil that hummed disapproval. He aimed it at the clouds and dared the world to say no. Their first contact on planet wasn't Thor. It was heretics between them and Thor. The traitors died like men who had been promised other deaths and were offended. Orcs praised the enemy for showing up and then took them apart. A weird boy drew down a white rope of sky and tried to eat it. His head bulged like a boiled egg. His eyes fired off in different directions, and he fell over laughing smoke, very pleased with himself. Storm boys screamed joy into the wind and described elegant circles around flak that couldn't be bothered to notice such commitment. Looters pointed at the distant glitter of a hammer and began arguing ownership with the far seriousness of thieves. The craft world saw green on the edge of their plan and made compensations. A troop of harlequins stepped out of a shadow that should not have been large enough for 1 foot and performed the oldest trick, distraction. A troop master with a grin that could cut cloth threw a handful of false thunder into the open plain. Hollow booms that felt like better fights than the one the orcs were having. Orcs love better fights. Half the mob turned as one and charged a mirage with full sincerity. The other half decided to steal the mirage's hat. The Wach sheared like water around a rock and flowed straight into a chaos gun line that had been bracing for humans. The gun line dissolved in a spray of jolly blue explosions. The orcs declared everyone involved their best friends. Sister Helix felt the green-skin field like she felt a hive chanting, a pressure of belief so thick it lent reality a slight headache. It shoved against her psalms, not malicious, just loud. She changed keys, not up or down but sideways, to a chant that reminded the air of laws it liked to keep. Warm air rises, cold air descends, thunder waits its turn. The storm settled enough to be aimed. The Inquisitor's teeth ground. Eldar interference, he said, as if he were naming a disease. The canoness didn't bother to disagree. If they are holding the scalpel steady while we cut, she said, you may complain after. He did not argue with a woman who had seen a cathedral topple and kept her hymn on the right beat. Jorund took to the alien plan with the enthusiasm of a man who loves a hunt more than he loves the politics of who brought the dogs. We heard their words, he told his pack, and made them ours. Hroth checked his axe for new chips, as if inspecting teeth before a feast. The wolves made ready the way storms make ready, by becoming themselves more completely. On the annex level, the forge's lockdown creaked open 1 blessed degree. Ferrum Lex kept his tongue and his hands in their lanes. Scarret adjusted the sensoria until they recorded not measurements but music, because music is a measurement when you have the right ear. The hammer settled on the block like a wolf on a rock, tolerant, apart, humor in its electricity. It let a line of not-sound purr through the annex. The machine spirits present, from the smallest servo skull to the oldest hoist, came to a consensus. This was not a blasphemy. This was an elder. Skitarii, sent to secure the relic in case of sudden heresy, kept their rifles very politely pointed at the floor. On the Manufactorum roof, the Farseer finished the last adjustment to a path no human would ever see, and handed Thor a direction with her chin. Now, she said. Swooping hawks kicked off into a sky that agreed with them. Scorpions slid away to places where killing felt like careful housework. Dire avengers set their lines at the angles that let small numbers act like more. The autarch drew 2 fingers across his brow plate. For war. For art. Thor planted his feet and asked the air for cooperation. It came like a crowd obeying a calm hand. Pressure fell where it should, rose where it must. Heat curved its spine. The storm, which had been all appetite and opinion, took instruction the way a horse takes a rider it respects. He tipped it toward the calling wound. The orcs saw the sky move like an invitation and took it personally. Warboss Krog Scrap, the name got bigger every time someone said it, pointed at Thor and declared a vision. We's gonna nick dat big zapper and hit Everfink with it. The mob cheered at the theological excellence of this plan. The zap pole, offended at not being central enough, spat a chain of raw storm at the clouds and got an answer. It grounded through a stomper's knee. The stomper learned humility and gravity at once. Orcs roared approval. The mech scribbled notes on a bit of his arm. Greenskin and Aeldari brush-fired across the plain without quite touching. Harlequins drew laughter and bullets and gave back knives. Rangers put polite holes in orc knobs who tried to organize things too much. A weird boy tried to bite a rune of warding and got a mouthful of nothing. He loved it. The Farseer kept her eye on the wound and one ear on thunder, her mind a loom knitting wind into a net. The Inquisitor's vox hissed with orders, counter-orders, and the kind of silence that means men are choosing to mishear things that would inconvenience them. Asset remains unbound, a voice from orbit noted. Clinical. Variable proceeding toward anomaly. Xenos presence, significant. Green skin vectors, increasing. He authorized and rescinded 3 different fire plans in the space of a breath, because every plan wanted to break the one good thing that was happening. He settled for this. No macro fire. No lance. We will not cut the surgeon with our scissors. Eldar bone singers planted 3 small seeds at 3 small places around the wound. Where they touched earth, the ground remembered spring. Sprouts of pale architecture uncurled and hummed a key under the storm's note, a scaffold for a closure that was going to happen to the sky. Thor felt them like sympathetic instruments. He set Mjolnir to the rhythm and let the hammer dictate timing the way it always had. The storm bore down, heavy as a choice. Orcs arrived in a glorious wrong place at the right time. Storm boys, contrails twisting like cursive, tried to spear the center of the thunder. Thor looked up and allowed the sky to introduce itself to their rockets. It did with impeccable manners, a kiss of static that turned fuel temperamental, a puff of rain that entered intakes exactly when it would be funniest. Half the storm boys swirled off into loops and found themselves headbutting heretics at better angles than planned. They decided the sky was on their side. The other half landed exactly where they wanted to, and discovered that a storm that likes you still enjoys reminding you it is bigger. They enjoyed that too. In the annex, Faramlex tried again, more humbly. "Designation?" he asked the hammer in high binary. "Intent?" The reply was not in any language the Mechanicus owned. It wrote itself as warmth on brass and a chorus in bearings, as a single character of meaning laid like a thumbprint on Scarlet's palm. It was not a word for hammer. It was a word for tool used correctly. Faramlex exhaled through his teeth and, for the first time in too long, felt like a student in a class that didn't hate him. On the roof, the Farseer's runes lay flat and humming. Perfect agreement. "Now," she said again, softer, to no one. Sister Halix's choir took breath together in the dark below, and the psalm came clean. Straight roads, closed doors to bad names, open doors to rain that washed without washing things away. The wolves rolled their shoulders. The canoness tightened a gauntlet. The autarch matched his heart to thunder. The wound in the sky pulsed as if deciding to be a mouth. It had learned the first syllable of something and wanted the second. Thor lifted the hammer as if he were about to knock on a door. Far off, under banners painted with lightning and promises of theft, a war boss who had promoted himself 3 times since breakfast raised a klaxon and bellowed, "The Thunder Boss is ours!" Every eye tilted up. Every gun forgot its patience. The storm drew a breath that felt like the whole world lying quiet, so you could hear one sentence properly. The sky came down to walking height and pressed its forehead to the world. Clouds rippled like muscle. The rain thickened until it was a curtain that cut the plain into stages. Out beyond the ruin fields, chaos rolled forward in ranks that looked like a factory got drunk and dreamed of knives, spiked armor, demon engines panting furnace heat, a night desecrator stalking on piston legs with a butcher's grace. At its feet strode a sorcerous warlord in scripture black, a word-bearer by the ugly beauty of his armor, staff topped with a book that wouldn't stop breathing. Sigils crawled across the air like stuckuders that liked grammar. On the wall, the wolves strapped their helms. "We go when the storm says now," Jorund growled, and his pack laughed low, because they could hear the now in their teeth. Hroth Ulfsbane rolled the ache out of his shoulder and adjusted the haft of his axe like a man checking an old friend's mood. Eldar shadows took their places with insultingly little footprint. Swooping hawks hung at the ceiling of the sky, wings tasting thermals Thor had laid out like stepping stones. Dire avengers set firing lines that looked wrong until you saw the angles, and then they were the only sane places to stand. Striking scorpions vanished into a puddle's black, then reappeared 2 streets away, with enemy throats already deciding they were done. The Farseer's runes hung in the rain, clicked once, and fell still. The autarch raised 2 fingers. Everything tensed without moving. Sister Halix stood on a broken gantry with her choir in the dark behind her, palms open, eyes closed. She found the pitch where thunder becomes a straight road. The psalm went out, not loud, just exact. Order likes exact. Thor stepped into the middle of all of it and lifted Mjolnir as if asking the world a question it wanted to answer. The storm leaned. Air pressure sagged over the heretic lines. Heat buckled. The horizon trembled as if a giant hand smoothed a crease. Chaos replied with doctrine. The word-bearer raised his staff and read a page that made the rain taste briefly like old coins. Wards unfurled above the war host, sigils stitched from spite, inverted prayers, the names of roads that go nowhere. A demon engine with a mouth full of chains coughed gouts of warp fire into the sky to seed it with bad ideas. The night desecrator's helm eyes brightened. Its reaper chainsword idled with the hungry purr of a predator that has seen a gate left open. Thor answered by taking the storm's endless appetite for noise and telling it to be patient. Lightning that wanted to lash out became a sheet, then a seam, then a single quivering line stretched between 2 clouds like a drawn bow. He let it hum. When the wards crested, thin points where they were strongest because pride likes corners, he loosed. The line dropped. The first sigil blew out like a candle in a jealous room. The second tore along its seam. The third held for a heartbeat. Then the psalm pushed, and it went the way of breath on glass. "Shields!" the word-bearer snapped, and his cultists obeyed by dying in neat, helpful rows that turned raw magic into smoke and excuses. The daemon engine barked a hissed curse and tried to rewrite the rain. The rain declined. Jorund didn't wait for permission that wasn't coming. "With me!" he roared, and the wolves went down the wall like a promise kept too long. They hit the first line of traitors like an avalanche that had bothered to learn swordplay. Bolters spoke, chainswords negotiated, ceramite shoulders knocked heretics off their ideas. Hroth slid under a snapping mauler fiend jaw, rapped its knuckle of a joint with his axe to remind it of physics, and stood as its arm forgot how to be attached. The night took the field the way mountains take horizons. Its carapace field bloomed, an oil-sheen shimmer. Havoc launchers flexed. Autocannons stitched a rip up the wall's face, punching chips of prayer off old stone. Each step hit with a bell's weight. It marked Thor with a hunter's cold fondness and turned, letting guns bring their slow conversation to bear. He didn't dodge the first volley. Heavy shots, brass cylinders thick as a man's calf, came in flat and well-aimed. He raised Mjolnir and caught the burst on the flat like a drummer catching a stick. Shock stacked into the head, ran down the haft, and bled out into the storm as heat. The air hissed. He walked forward. "Persistent current," Scarlet muttered into a forge vox, watching from the shrine annex, hands hovering over votive controls he was not touching. Ferrum Lex pretended not to listen, and listened. He is not peaking the shield. He is drowning it. Thor set the sky to needlework, not the grand gesture, no flamboyant bolts, no drama. just a steady rain of small, exact discharges at the far edge of the knight's field, at knee height, elbow height, the angle of its neck ring. The void skin accepted the first dozen with noble disdain, the next 100 with queasy patience, the next 1,000 with a little noise, and then it was too late to remember how to be arrogant. The sheen thinned. Capacitors whined in a pitch that made servos twitch. The knight's pilot hauled on the yoke and flooded power to the field. The field drank. Thor fed it more of the wrong flavor. Time. Down! Jorund barked on an open channel, and his pack flattened as the knight's reaper chain came lateral, scything a smear of rain and air where Astarte's heads had just been. Hroth stepped in and banged the teeth with his axe at exactly the moment they wanted to bite. The chain stumbled against its own certainty, and the engine coughed a belch of sparks. The word-bearer saw momentum shift and did what priests do when a sermon starts to wilt. He yelled louder. His staff wrote a line of bad grammar into the air and tried to shove it down Thor's throat. A binding. Not a big one, just enough to trip. Sister Helix felt the hook and sang a straight line through it. It slid off and went hunting for a weaker mouth. Now, the Farseer breathed, not at Thor, not at anyone, at the skein. Hawks dropped grenades neat as punctuation along a trench where bondsmen had parked their faith. Scorpions came up like weeds and pulled men under. Dire avengers scythed volleys at angles that weren't fair. The Autarch led a charge where the road surface happened to be exactly the way a dire avenger likes road surfaces to be. The knight's field hiccuped once, twice, and fell. The storm, which had been tapping politely on the windows, stepped inside. Thor moved. 1 stride, 2, and threw in a way that wasn't a throw so much as a verdict. Mjolnir curved, not arced, not guessed, curved in the mathematician's sense, around the knight's shoulder, clipped just under the pauldron, and broke the cantilever of the upper carapace with a crack that rang like a cathedral bell being honest. Armor plates leapt with the impulse, hydraulic lines burst and wrote hot scripture on the rain. The pilot yanked for a back step and got a kneel instead. "Take it!" Jorund howled, and packs slammed into the knight's left, riding the stagger, punching cracks into joints as if they were offenses. Hroth hammered the elbows lock. The chain whir whined up, then coughed to a halt as a crack charge fulfilled its simple fantasy. The knight swayed, swung a backhand that gathered 2 wolves and threw them like stones and tried to stand. The hammer came back, kissed the helm rim, and dented it in a way that made machine spirits wince. The word-bearer fled forward under the knight's shadow, staff held high, breath spell sour. He unrolled a leash of syllables designed to wrap a name, and made the mistake of saying it aloud. "Thor," he began. The storm objected. Thunder landed between the syllables like a door slammed on someone rude. The staff vomited a ribbon of blue that broke into butterflies, and then knives, and then nothing. The book on its top snapped shut on the preacher's fingers, and he howled, not because it hurt, but because humiliation is a better teacher than pain. Chaos paid humiliation in metal. A hell-brute charged on piston stumps, mind screaming hymns it hated, and reached for Thor with hands like clamps. He stepped aside and let it own a patch of ground it didn't want. The hammer came up and struck the back of its knee where the plates were overstated for theater and undersupported for reality. It folded, roaring in 2 voices, and a long fang on the wall put a crack through the polygon where a pilot's despair had rusted the welds. The desecrator lurched to its feet for the last time. Carapace cracked, field gone, pilot eyes full of a faith that had been asked for interest too long. It raised the chainsword for a desperate chop meant to cut a saga into Thor's head. He stepped into the arc, not out of it, set the hammerhead under the sword's guard, and lifted. The strike missed. The chain snagged on its own frontal plating and chewed a scream into its face. Voidless, humbled, wrong-footed, it took one step back and found there was no more field to lean on. The hammer rose. The storm's breath held. It fell, and the knight's helm sprang open like a confession, spitting sparks and smoke as it slumped to one knee and then over onto its shoulder. The ground said enough and took it. The warhost staggered but did not break. Berserkers howled joy and sprinted into the wolves with relief that someone was finally doing something simple. Possessed things tried to find purchase on Eldar Grace and discovered that elegance is a weapon if the hand holding it refuses to move wrong. A warpsmith, another one, their kind breed like bad ideas, hurled chainlight at the Bonesinger seeds and began erecting grounded rods to drink the storm. Orcs arrived like a punchline and a problem. "The Thunder Boss!" the war boss bellowed, hat taller than the last time you saw him, because ambition is cumulative. Storm Boys wrote question marks in contrails. Weird Boys' eyes overflowed with happy lightning. Shooters hammered the horizon because horizons are obvious. They crashed into everything that moved and some things that didn't. Green skin field pressure made stray bolts luckier and bad shots fatal. An orc mech sighted Thor across the battlefield, sketched the shape of Mjolnir in the air with greed, and began building a plan out of theft. The Farseer's jaw set. "Keep them off the seeds," she told the troop, and Harlequins obliged by dancing insults into orc pathfinding instincts. The troop master flicked a deck of light like knives, carving invitations that led into culverts, onto slip-slick metal, through doors that weren't there. Orcs cursed, laughed, followed, fell, stood, followed again, as happy being fooled as doing the fooling. Sister Hallex felt the warp roll over like a dog offering a trick. It had learned the first half of Thor's rhythm and wanted to sing along. She pushed her choir hard. Voices cracked, noses bled. The psalm didn't get louder. It got cleaner. Thunder found its lane again. The word-bearer gambled everything on a name. He spoke it in a voice that wore 3 different ages at once and 4 different hierarchies of authority. It wasn't Thor, not exactly. Something sideways to it. A label meant to be hook and leash both. Storm Warden. Duty-flavored. A thing the Imperium would conspire to believe. Names are nets. It cast. The strike went through the choir like wire. Novices arched. One vomited, one fainted. One kept singing because Sister Hallex was looking. The Farseer's runes skittered. Jorund felt his teeth ache as if a wind were trying to whistle through them. Thor caught the hook in the meat of his intent. For a heartbeat, the shape of him pulled toward Ward. It would have fit. It would have felt right in the wrong way, easy as water running downhill. He did something ugly to avoid it. He let a strike miss. The hammer came down on mud instead of bone. The jolt up the arm was ungraceful and immediate. He took it. He said no to the name by doing something that didn't suit it. Mjolnir hummed in his palm, surprised, pleased. The hook passed without furniture to catch. Scarret swore aloud in the annex, all composure gone. "It's learning him," he said, "and he's learning it back." The seeds of wraithbone had grown into a low, pale lattice around the wound, 3 curving ribs of almost architecture that hummed at the edge of hearing. The storm leaned into them, and they held like a singer taking a harmony. A tremor went through the air that wasn't weather, and the world ticked, as if someone had opened a watch and nudged the escapement. The mouth in the sky tried to learn its second syllable. Sister Hallex took breath. The wolves stepped into another line of red and made it shorter. Eldar ran their weapons like pens and wrote endings on enemies' chests. The warpsmith's rods stabbed up and drank too much thunder. For a moment, their rings glowed full and honest. Then they remembered they were made by a man who believed in shortcuts. The first rod blew, the second ground. The third spat itself in half. A knight on the ridge stomped the wreckage with a priest's precision. Orcs cheered and took credit. The word-bearer, bleeding from the ears and delighted because it meant he was near something dangerous, raised his staff for the last time and tried one more binding. He never finished it. A bolt from the wall, aimed by a guardsman with hands, steady for once in his life, stitched through his ledger of a heart. He looked surprised to be interrupted by reality, then offended, then fell, staff and book clattering in the rain like lyres. Silence gathered. Not absence of noise, but the pause in music when everyone in the hall has leaned forward together. Thor stood at the lattice, hammer held as if to knock, and whispered something that was not a word, and not a spell, and not a prayer. It was a habit, offered to a sky that had learned to trust it. The lattice sang. The storm pressed. The wound folded. It did not slam shut. It closed like an eye that has seen enough. The pressure eased with a long, shivering exhale. Demon engines lost interest in living. Berserkers screamed outrage at the sudden lack of justification for bliss and died with professional pride. Orcs cheered because something big had happened. Eldar ghosted, leaving angles and faint contempt. The wolves howled a long, proud note that bounced off dead metal and came back sounding like home. The Night Desecrator lay broken, helm open, pilot gasping litany fragments that were mostly apologies, mostly too late. Jorund stood over him, axe low, breath frosting. He looked at Thor. Thor looked back and did nothing. The pilot closed his eyes in relief that smelled like oil and rain. On the wall, the canoness crossed herself with the same hand she used for shooting. The Inquisitor lowered his rosette as if it had grown heavy. "Variable remains. Extant," he said, tired bureaucracy clinging to the last clothes it owned. Provisional clearance extended under condition of observation. He didn't look up while saying it. He didn't need to. Sister Hallex sagged against a rail and laughed once without humor. Her novices slumped where they stood. One of them whispered, "Did we win?" And Hallex, who had lived too long to trust that word, said, "We stopped something," and let that be the truth for a minute. Orcs, having decided that victory had been achieved by the correct number of explosions, began arguing about who got to nick the big hammer. The argument turned into a fist fight, turned into a celebration, turned into a gun battle, turned into a migration, as Harlequins led them away with jokes. The war boss vowed eternal friendship, and vowed to kill Thor later, and vowed to take his hat back from a mime he definitely remembered, even if he didn't. He left with half a knight's shoulder plate and a sense of religious fulfillment. Scarlet reached out in the annex, and after a breath's hesitation, let his brass knuckle brush the hammer's rim. A spark kissed him. It wrote that same single character on his skin. Tool used correctly. He nodded, chastened by hope. Night came down properly for the first time in months. It rained like ordinary weather, and Hellwinter 9 remembered how to smell wet stone and oil without fear. Men counted bodies. Sisters counted candles. Wolves counted scars. Eldar didn't count at all. They left a windrose scratched into a beam and the faintest impression of laughter that wasn't mockery. In the quiet after, the storm did not fully leave. It loitered like a song stuck in the throat of the world. Somewhere in the high cloud, something had learned a syllable of a name and was rehearsing its pronunciation. Sister Halix felt it in her molars. The Farseer felt it as a weight in the skein, a knot that would not untie itself. Jorund felt it as a rumor his grandchildren would chase. The Inquisitor felt it as a memorandum he wouldn't be able to file. Thor stood on the wall with Hroth, watching the plain go dark in honest ways. "You could stay," Hroth said, not as recruiter, not as priest, just as a man who had enjoyed a good fight beside someone who made the world make more sense for a while. "I could," Thor said. He looked at the hive spires where candles crawled up the dark. He looked at the sky where the last lightning stitched itself into silence. He looked down at Mjolnir, which sat quiet and heavy in his hand like a promise kept. "But I hear my name in the storm, and I don't like how it sounds." He smiled, a tired, unroyal thing. "I will walk it quiet again." "Storm will miss you," Hroth said. "It will complain." "It always does." He stepped away from the parapet, and the rain parted for him without ceremony. He did not take the oaths offered by the ecclesiarchy, who had turned up late with a small choir and a large pen. He did not answer the Inquisitor's binding litany, though he listened with the courtesy due a dangerous man who had not yet decided whether to be an enemy. He nodded to the canoness, and she inclined her head the smallest degree that says, "I will not write a miracle on the wrong line." He touched the plinth in the annex as he passed, and the machine spirits there thrummed a note Scarlet would be hearing in his dreams for the rest of his long, faithful life. At the edge of the city, he stopped and looked back once, and the storm lit the horizon the way old photographs catch a man's face when he isn't ready. Then he threw the hammer and followed it, drawing a line of light that didn't burn, and the rain took his footsteps like a secret. If you made it this far into the storm, thank you for traveling with us. This was a fan-made collision of sagas. A thunder god dropped into the cruelest century, held to ruthless 40K logic. Want more impossible matchups, sector-shaking battles, and what-if epics? Subscribe, drop your next crossover in the comments, and tell me which faction should hunt or help the storm next. Until then, keep your bolter dry, your wards tight, and your imagination louder than the thunder.